This objective is summarize the human population problem and possible solutions to the problem. So first we'll talk about what is the human population problem and how did human population explode. And we'll talk about why it's a problem. And then we'll discuss some possible solutions and why it's a tricky question. So this graphic over here shows the demographic transition, which is a trend where death rates are really drastically dropped through improvements in technology or medical advances or agricultural, etc. But birth rates stay high for a while. They lag behind the drop in death rate, and that's where you see a huge increase in population growth. So first, how did human population explode? The overview of human population growth is that human population has grown exponentially since about the year 1800. And the overarching idea of how human population growth increased so much is that we increased the carrying capacity for the human species. And we did that by eliminating limiting factors for growth. So we got rid of obstacles that were stopping growth before. And a few of these were improvements in agriculture. So with the Industrial Revolution and mechanized agricultural systems, we were able to feed a lot more people a lot more easily. Another big piece of how human population growth was really kicked off was the advent of the germ theory and increased sanitary living conditions. So this also went hand in hand with medical developments like vaccines and antibiotics. So people were living in more hygienic conditions and not getting sick from as many diseases, and that led to longer lifespans and lower death rates. So next, why is human population growth a problem, or why can't it be a problem? So these could fall under two overarching categories. And the first is our ecological footprint, and the second is the issues of inequity that come along with population growth. So our ecological footprint first. So physically, we could fit more people on Earth, but the space that a human takes up is not the same as what's needed for sustaining their life. So all the space that we require for our consumption needs to be considered too. And this is called our ecological footprint. So the space we need for different things that we use to survive, such as food, clean water, non-renewable resources like metals or minerals or fossil fuels, and also waste, space to store waste that we produce. So all of these things that we need for life require space to grow, space to mine, space to store waste. And population growth can be a problem because the consumption rate of individuals in some parts of the world is higher than the Earth can sustain. Not all individuals in the Earth's population consume equally. People in parts of Southeast Asia or Africa, for example, have vastly smaller rates of consumption or their ecological footprint than people in, say, North America. And as the population of Earth continues to grow and more populations become more wealthy, which generally leads to more consumption, we're going to have a harder time coming up with enough space to provide the resources that everyone needs, as well as the space that other species need, because as humans grow, we take resources and space like water, trees, and soil from other species. And another perspective that we could look at population growth and its problems through is a more sociological perspective. We won't get into this too much because it is biology class, but it definitely should be touched on. So the rate of population growth peaked in about the 1960s, and the rate has fallen ever since. We're still growing, but not as rapidly. And why is this happening? Mostly because of cultural reasons. So for example, since the 1960s, women have gotten more education and more opportunities in the workforce and more choices. And also our lifestyles in industrialized countries have changed from farm living to more urban living. So people don't need a dozen kids to work on the farm. And another big factor is more access to birth control. So families had more choices. But in places that still have very rapid rates of population growth, there tends to be less equity and less opportunity, less education for people, and especially for women. For example, the girls dropping out of school or not allowed to go to school, or child marriages, or limited access to birth control. So looked at through this lens, extremely rapid population growth rates are more of a symptom rather than a problem itself. And if you can address the equity and human rights piece of it, then people would be able to make more informed decisions for themselves, and population growth would likely be more sustainable because of that. So possible solutions to the human population growth problem. So the first most obvious solution that you might suggest would be slow down population growth. And this has been attempted in different parts of the world throughout history. So yes, you can create mandates or laws to slow population growth. But then this can bring up problems of its own. One, because like I mentioned before, not all individuals in the population consume equally. So just because you're reducing the rate of population growth doesn't mean you're reducing consumption rates. And so we still need resources for those individuals that are consuming high rates and have a larger ecological footprint. So one better idea to reduce or to address the human population problem is to reduce our ecological footprints, reduce our consumption rates. And this is mostly people in wealthy industrialized countries. And a large piece of this is to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. And then another possible solution to addressing human population growth is, as I mentioned before, address the human rights piece of it. So reducing population growth in just and as a blanket statement is a problematic approach, because you have to ask who gets the message, who gets this approach directed at them the most. And it usually would be people of lower socioeconomic status or vulnerable populations and minorities, and especially women, the ones who are giving birth to children. So the question of reducing human population growth can bring up all sorts of these tricky questions and can implicate racism and sexism and xenophobia. So it's also a piece of this that's also important to consider is, and questions that are important to ask is, when you talk about reducing population, is how do you control that? How do you carry it out? And then you have to start asking questions like how many children are allowed and who are allowed to have children. And again, then that can leave other groups that are less advantaged, disadvantaged by this system. So another piece of this to consider is that controlling population growth can start getting into the territory of eugenics. And eugenics is an ideology that has waxed and waned in popularity throughout history, but it's essentially the belief that certain groups of people have more desirable genetics and they should be the ones reproducing, and people with less desirable genetics and traits should not reproduce. So in the early 1900s, this was a big idea, and proponents of eugenics claimed that they wanted to improve the human population and control population growth through controlling breeding or reproduction. And they maintained that the evidence was clear that negative or undesirable traits were caused by bad genes, and not racism or socioeconomics or the social views of the time. So proponents of genetics did this through forced sterilization or laws against and for who could get married. And even eugenics has been used as a rationale that has progressed all the way to genocide. It was a large piece of what Hitler used to carry out the Holocaust. So controlling and considering how to address the human population growth problem has a lot of tricky issues, is the point I'm getting at. So again, maybe the best approach to the human population problem is to look at the human rights piece of it. So make population growth more sustainable, make birth control more accessible, allow more education and choices for people, especially women, and those in countries that are still experiencing very high population growth rates. So that's the key idea. We shouldn't just focus on curbing population growth at all costs. We need to adjust our views on consumption, our ecological footprints, and human rights in order to grow more sustainably.